We're in Spain, 1981, inside the National Assembly in Madrid. Just out of frame is Deputy Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo. He's trying to drum up support and gather the necessary votes to become the new Prime Minister of Spain. But it hasn't been easy. His own party is crumbling. Before the voting can continue, there's a moment of confusion. A man dressed in a military uniform walks up to the podium. He's holding a pistol. The man speaks up. Then chaos breaks loose. No one outside the assembly knows it yet, but Spain is going through a fascist coup d'etat, and a civil war might be seconds away from destroying the entire country. Today, Spain is part of the European Union. It's a multi-party democracy and a constitutional monarchy, but this is relatively new. Spain was once one of Europe's most isolated countries, led by a hugely controversial figure, Francisco Franco. Franco was Spain's response to the rising fascism of the 20s and 30s. Like Mussolini or Hitler, Franco gave himself the title of El Caudillo, or the strongman. In 1936, he joined a group of military officers in launching a coup against the then Republican government of Spain. And by 1939, he triumphed and led a monarchist, ultra-Catholic, and fascist faction to victory that ended the bloody Spanish Civil War. But by 1981, he'd been dead for 6 years. Yet his ghost was reaching across the grave and risking the country falling into a bloody conflict all over again. So who is the man with the gun holding all of Spain on the brink? Back in the assembly hall, the tension is through the roof. Almost all of the representatives are ducking behind their benches. Almost all except for 3 men. Manuel Gutierrez Mellado, the former Minister of Defense and the current Deputy Prime Minister, is confronting the attackers. He's a lieutenant general and outranks everyone else in the room, but the soldiers don't comply. High above in the back benches, Santiago Carrillo, the leader of the Communist Party, sits calmly, smoking a cigarette. Adolfo Suarez, Spain's first democratically elected prime minister, doesn't move. But they were all at the mercy of this man, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero. Another one of the insurrectionists gets on the stage and says, "We're waiting for the right military authority to come, and he will do what must be done." By now, however, the country was realizing what was going on, and a power vacuum was quickly taking over and threatening all of Spain. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, Francisco Franco began consolidating power. Despite cozy relationships with the Nazi regime and fascist Italy, he stayed neutral during World War II. Spain had lost somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million people during its own internal conflict, but now Franco had ultimate control. Under his rule, his authority was unchecked. He didn't create a constitution. His rubber stamp parliament was even weaker than those in other authoritarian regimes. And despite proclaiming Spain a monarchy, he didn't actually name a monarch. Franco's base, however, was not uniform. Early on, it was divided between 4 groups: the army, the church, the monarchists, and the party, El Movimiento Nacional. However, after the Axis lost the war, Spain became isolated and its economy stagnated. Franco pivoted. He neutralized some of the fascist elements of the party and promoted technocrats to positions of authority. Spain joined countries like Italy and France in ushering in a quote-unquote economic miracle. As Spain opened up, people's incomes increased, and radical elements were further marginalized. Franco's grip, however, weakened. And to try to maintain the future of Spain under his vision, under his movimiento, he named a successor no one saw coming. While the parliament was being held hostage, the coup's second operation began. 200 miles away in Valencia, Lieutenant General Jaime Milans del Bosch declares martial law. 2,000 soldiers and 50 tanks roll into the streets of the city. Local and regional government buildings are occupied, and all radio stations are forced to relay a message from Bosch. Bosch begins executing the third phase of the operation. He calls the military commanders from the rest of Spain. If he's able to convince them to join his martial law, the coup succeeds. At the time, Spain had 13 military regions carving up the country. Bosch was able to take over this one. However, none of the other regions backed him. But that doesn't mean the coup is over. None of the regions outright joined him, but 5 say that if he's able to get more support, they'll pledge allegiance. And the key region to take over? Madrid. By the late 1960s, Franco was aging and in faltering health. While the country was still firmly a one-party dictatorship and guerrillas left over from the Civil War had been stamped out years earlier, a new opposition was taking shape. Franco's own liberalization and push for technocrats to have independence led to an uneasy tension between hardliners in power and the general public's sentiment of what Spain's future should look like. European integration was taking shape, and many felt Spain was being left out. Despite the country banning other political movements, protests over wages, regionalist independence, and against the Francoist patronage increased during this time. Franco had few choices, but whoever his successor was, he knew he had to appease 2 powerful bases, the army and the monarchists. When he died, Spain was to be an absolute monarchy. Franco eventually chose the then 31-year-old Juan Carlos as his heir apparent. This came as a surprise. He wasn't first in line to the re-established throne, and his father was at times an ardent anti-Francoist and pro-democratic reformer. Still, from 1969 until Franco's death in 1975, the young Prince of Spain, Juan Carlos, was outwardly a loyal supporter of the regime and of Franco. Everyone thought he would continue the caudillo's legacy. But behind the scenes, Juan Carlos was planning something else. Early on, after being named Franco's successor, he began contacting opposition figures and reform-minded military chiefs. So in public, he maintained a hardline facade, but behind the scenes, he was seeing if Spain could change. Then, in 1975, Franco dies, and the Prince Juan Carlos becomes King Juan Carlos I. He has absolute power, but to everyone's surprise, one of his first decrees was to limit his own authority. Over the next 4 years, Spain was able to accomplish something few countries have ever been able to do: a legal, peaceful transition to democracy. But this process was almost undone by the coup. To understand why Antonio Tejero, Jaime Milans del Bosch, and a number of other high-ranking officials decided to launch a coup on February 23, 1981, we need to understand what the Spanish transition to democracy was like, and we need to understand the bunker. Spain in the 70s was a bit of a show. Despite the regime's best efforts, nationalist tensions in the Basque Country and Catalonia were not going away. On top of this, left-wing activism and organization, despite being clandestine and banned on paper, was seeing a resurgence for the first time since the Civil War. 3 major events of this era need to be mentioned. In 1970, 16 Basque separatists were put on trial for murder. What was supposed to be a show trial for the regime turned into a huge domestic and international debacle. As a show of force, the government sought the death penalty. But to the greater Basque populace in some regions like Catalonia, the accused should have been shown mercy. In the weeks leading up to the verdict, hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike, and displays of solidarity occurred. Then, after the defendants were convicted and sentenced to death, the Vatican stepped in and asked Franco directly to commute their sentences. Franco complied, but the cracks were beginning to show, and the next crack would shake the highest rung of power in the state. Franco knew he needed a political successor beyond that of the king. That successor would be Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco. Carrero Blanco had been Franco's most trusted ally for decades. He was the regime's fixer. In 1973, Franco made it official and appointed Blanco prime minister, the first person other than himself to hold that title in over 30 years. But on December 20th, 1973, Carrero Blanco was on his way to morning mass in central Madrid. Members of the Basque separatist group ETA were waiting for him. Below the road to the church, they planted explosives the equivalent of 120 pounds of TNT in a tunnel. When the car passed overhead, the tunnel detonated. The blast was so powerful it launched the armored car over a 5-story building and into a second-floor courtyard on the other side. Carrero Blanco was killed. Franco lost his successor, the regime lost its future, and the hardliners lost the one man who might have held everything together. By now, Franco was 81 and visibly deteriorating, and he never fully recovered from the blow. 2 years later, he died. The king enacted reforms, the government towed the line, but by 1977, Spain was in a delicate political balancing act. Parties were being slowly legalized, but one movement remained banned: the communists. Their legalization came about after the third major event we need to mention: the massacre of Atocha. The first open elections in 40 years took place in late 1977. Broadly stated, the main outcome of this election was moderation. Centrists won power, willing to continue the liberalization of the country. But in the margins of this new society, certain elements were loyal to Francoism, and they weren't happy. They had influence, strength, and they were deadly. These elements were known as the bunker. Their mortal foes were the communists. At one of the PCE's offices on the night of January 24th, 1977, a group of far-right gunmen linked to the bunker walked in. They opened fire. 5 labor lawyers were killed, 4 others seriously wounded. It was a massacre, and it was designed to provoke. The far right wanted chaos. They wanted the communists to retaliate, to take to the streets violently, to give the military an excuse to step in and shut the whole transition down. But it didn't work. Santiago Carrillo, the leader of the PCE, the same man who would later sit calmly smoking a cigarette during the coup, made a decision. No retaliation, no violence, just a funeral. A few days after the massacre, over 100,000 people walked through the streets of Madrid in complete silence. It was one of the most powerful demonstrations in Spanish history. It was their way of saying that the communists could be trusted to play by democratic rules. And it worked. 3 months later, in April of 1977, the PCE was legalized. And later that year, they would come in 3rd place at the polls, solidifying their role in the transition. Back in Madrid, the coup is now going into the late hours of the night. Tejero is still holding parliament hostage. Milans del Bosch has tanks in the streets of Valencia, and 5 military regions are sitting on the fence, waiting to see which way the wind blows. The entire transition, everything Spain had built since Franco's death, comes down to one man: King Juan Carlos. The conspirators had assumed, or at least hoped, that the king would back them. After all, he was Franco's hand-picked successor. They thought he'd surely go with a coup that restored order and put the military back in charge, but he didn't. Juan Carlos spent the night on the phone. One by one, he called every military region commander in the country. He gave them an order: stand down or stand against the crown. He was using the very authority Franco had given him, the legitimacy of the monarchy, the chain of command the old regime had built, to defend the democracy that had replaced it. One by one, the wavering regions fell in line. Then, just after midnight, Juan Carlos appeared on national television in full military uniform. He addressed the country directly. He made it clear, The crown would not tolerate any attempt to interrupt the democratic process by force. He had ordered the military to defend the constitutional order, and he did this not just as king, but as commander-in-chief. It was over. The hostages walked free. Among them, Adolfo Suarez, the man who had shepherded Spain from dictatorship to democracy as its first elected prime minister. He'd been forced to resign weeks earlier, his own party fracturing, the economy stalling, ETA still killing. The vote that Tejero interrupted was to replace him, and Gutierrez Mellado, the old lieutenant general who had stood up and confronted armed soldiers half his age, walked out too. The vote that had been interrupted resumed. Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo, the man we saw at the beginning of the story, finally got his vote. He became Prime Minister of Spain. The conspirators were arrested and tried. Tejero was sentenced to 30 years. Milán del Bosch, 30 years. Most of the other officers involved received lighter sentences. Some served barely a few years. No one was executed. Spain had abolished the death penalty in its 1978 constitution, the same constitution the coup had tried to destroy. The night of February 23rd became simply known as 23F, and it did something no one expected. It didn't weaken Spanish democracy, it made it stronger. Before 23F, the transition still felt fragile. Many Spaniards weren't sure if democracy could last, if the military would accept it, if the old guard would ever truly let go. After 23F, they had their answer. The country stared down the ghost of Franco, and it didn't blink. Spain's transition is sometimes called a miracle, and in some ways it was, but it wasn't clear. It wasn't inevitable, and it almost didn't happen.